have breaking news. In a recording now heard by CNN, President Trump is warning of violence if Republicans lose the midterm elections and Democrats take over up on Capitol Hill. Speaking last night before evangelical leaders at a dinner over at the White House, the president said, and I'm quoting now from the recording that CNN has heard, "I think we're popular, but there's a real question as to whether people are going to vote if I'm not on the ballot." And I'm not on the ballot. A lot of people think I don't like Congress. People say I'm not voting because the president doesn't like Congress. It's not a question of like or dislike. It's a question that they will overturn everything that we've done, and they will do it quickly and violently. And violently. The president said, there is violence, his words. When you look at Antifa, these are violent people, he continues. You have tremendous power. You were saying in this room, you have people who preach to almost 200 million people, depending on which Sunday we're talking about, close quote. That from the president. Let's get some insight from our political, legal, and law enforcement analysts. Jackie Kucinich, pretty strong words from the president predicting violence if the Democrats take control, the majority in the House of Representatives.
Well, he certainly isn't the first person to scare people to the polls. And if he's asking these reverends and whatnot to do that, it's irresponsible to say that there's going to be violence if Democrats take over. That's not true. There's no proof of that. But this isn't a president that deals in facts. But this won't be the only time that we see this sort of exaggerations in the 2018 midterms. We're going to see this as a thread throughout the entire cycle. If it's not Antifa, it'll be immigration, it'll be MS-13. This is going to be a thread.
And because the president was with this closed-door meeting with these evangelical leaders, Sabrina Siddiqui, and it was closed to the press, but we did hear a recording. CNN did hear a recording. And once again, let me read those key words. They will overturn everything that we've done, and they will do it quickly and violently, and violently. There is violence. And then he referred to Antifa.
Well, first and foremost, it's clear that the president does sound very concerned about how the midterm elections might play out. And the rhetoric that we're hearing from him is not at all dissimilar to the words he used on the campaign trail in 2016, when he similarly predicted that there would be violence if Hillary Clinton were to have won in November. In fact, he incited violence among his supporters on more than one occasion. And what is striking about this is presidents often engage in, or politicians often engage in, inflammatory rhetoric that might suit their message. And certainly we've seen this president in particular exaggerate, as Jackie was alluding to. But there is a way in which they stick to some norms when it comes to trying to defend their majority in Congress when it comes to midterm elections. And this is a president who clearly does not have confidence in being able to run on his own agenda. So what he resorts to is trying to sow discord among the American public. And that is what is so dangerous about these comments. They certainly undermine the democratic process and the way in which our midterm elections typically take place.
What do you think, Susan?
I mean, I think it is astonishing rhetoric to hear from the President of the United States. He's not just on the campaign trail any longer. He is in a position where he's supposed to represent larger American values. And in some sense, you have to wonder whether or not these are not the kinds of comments that actually incite violence, because the President is discussing what is a peaceful process, and has always been a peaceful process in the United States of America, as if it is some kind of actual violent struggle. Whenever we see some of the rhetoric that we've seen, from the alt-right and elsewhere, it really does make you concerned that the message, whatever the president intends, the message that other people are going to receive is, we're talking about not the peaceful election of a different party, but the violent overthrow of a government.
And he's referring specifically to this group, Antifa. But go ahead, you know something about them.
That's right. I mean, what is law enforcement supposed to do with this information? The United States, President of the United States sets policy as far as what the Department of Justice will look at and what law enforcement will look at. So what is he saying now? That law enforcement should start looking into this now? What is the prescription? Because if there's a threat that's on the table that he somehow knows about, then law enforcement has to act on it. I think it's irresponsible.
What about this group he's specifically referring to? You're a former FBI supervisory agent.
That's right. And this is an issue, a group that has been of concern. If you look at some of the rallies, I mean, they've obviously been out there very, in instance, there has been violence, but it doesn't appear that, at least coming from the Department of Justice, from the FBI, that this rises to the case where this is a national pandemic that law enforcement is now combating. I think this is pure politics. This has nothing to do with national security. Essentially, it's a dog whistle to say, look, if these people come out, if you don't come out and counter this and we don't win, then bad things will happen. Again, it's so irresponsible for the commander.
You remember, and Sabrina makes a good point, during the election campaign, he was repeatedly suggesting there were going to be millions of illegal votes. It was going to be rigged if he lost the election.
Well, he even had a commission that was supposed to look into this, and that didn't really go anywhere because it wasn't true. I think it really is interesting, and Sabrina said this, but why isn't the president talking about the economy? He does occasionally, but in theory, that's the only thing, tax cuts in the economy, that the president should be talking about, because that is a winning message. But apparently that's not enough for him, and he has to resort to these scare tactics. Perhaps it's habit because of the campaign trail, or it really is perplexing given the fact that Republicans really do have something to talk about going into the midterm elections.
Yeah, and it is pretty extraordinary for the president to be predicting at this stage, about 70 days or so before the midterm elections, that if the Democrats win, become the majority, he says everything that he has achieved will be thrown out. It's not a question of like or dislike. It's a question that they will overturn everything that we've done. They will do it quickly and violently. Then he repeated, and violently, there is violence.
Well, it's any president's job to try and encourage the public to come together, even when an election hasn't gone in the way of his own party. And that's something we simply haven't seen from President Trump. And I think that ultimately we don't know what will happen in November, but he is already trying to undermine the legitimacy of Democrats if they were to retake control of Congress, which is ironic since this is a president who is very sensitive to any allegation that his legitimacy might be called into question as we talk about the ongoing investigation into Russian interference in the election. But I also thought Jackie raised an interesting point when she mentioned MS-13, because he's talking about Antifa. MS-13 is, of course, the president tries to push forward this notion that they pose a very real threat here in this country when they only make up for less than 1% of gangs in the United States. So a lot of his own messaging very much is rooted in fear-mongering. That's the only way that he has shown himself is knowing how to campaign.
I also think we should be clear about what the president is actually afraid of if Congress shifts parties, and that's his own personal impeachment. So anytime that the democratic process produces outcomes that are not favorable to the president, he declares those processes illegitimate. And so I think that this is part of that same broader trend. It really has nothing to do with sort of his actual policy accomplishments and everything to do with his basic political survival.
Because if the Democrats are the majority in the House, they can subpoena anyone they want. They can investigate anything they want. They can have hearings on anything they want. And they can certainly have impeachment hearings if that's what they want.